Hello and welcome everyone to Matriarch Illuminations, the fourth event in a five-part series hosted by Jessica Wood. My name is Lillian Shamzamiri and I'm a Master's of Public Policy and Global Affairs student at UBC School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, and I'm looking forward to learning with you tonight. I acknowledge the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people whose traditional unceded territories I join this evening's virtual gathering from as an uninvited guest and settler in today's Point Grey, British Columbia, that also hosts the University of British Columbia Vancouver campus that has brought us together this evening for this important conversations. Since we're on a virtual platform, I'd like to invite you to reflect upon the Indigenous lands that you are on today. I reflect on this sacred gathering space that provides us with an opportunity to engage in and understand reconciliation. As a settler living on the land that multiple generations of First Nations people have protected and honored, I'm reminded to take responsibility for the past and present harms done onto Indigenous communities, their traditional lands and waters that they have cared for time immemorial, that my loved one and I are able to call home today. Before continuing, I would like to mention two housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded and that later on we'll be taking audience questions, so you're welcome to add your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat at the bottom of your screen. I now wish to introduce you to the creator of this dynamic series, Jessica Wood. Jessica Wood is known as Si Sityaawks, and she is a Policy Practitioner Fellow at our school, SPPGA. Jessica is Gitxsan and Tsimshian nations with extended roots with the Tahltan and Nisga'a Nations. She's currently serving as the Assistant Deputy Minister for Reconciliation, Transformation, and Strategies Division with the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation for the province of British Columbia, although not tonight, to be clear. Jessica is leading BC's cross-ministry work to adopt and implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of Canada's calls to action, and learning from the relevant case law, such as Si Sityaawks decision. Tonight's theme is Making Law and Policy, Matriarch Traditions, and it's my pleasure to also introduce our special guest, Dr. Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond at Kikway, the Academic Director of the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center at UBC. She's a Canadian lawyer, former judge, legislative advocate for children's rights, and a professor at UBC's Allard School of Law. She holds a law degree from Osgoode Hall at York University and a master's degree in international law from the University of Cambridge and a doctorate of law from Harvard Law School. As a member of the Musqueam Lake Cree Nation, Akikway was the first Treaty Indian to be named to the judicial bench in Saskatchewan. She has served as a representative for children and youth for BC and continues to draft legislation, provide legal advice, and speak to all levels of government. It's now my honor to turn it over to Jessica Wood and to have the opportunity to listen and to learn with you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Lillian. Really appreciate that warm introduction. Simgiget, Sikadam Hanak, Si Sityaawks Dibayu. My name is Si Sityaawks. My English name is Jessica Wood. And I want to take a moment to thank not only Lillian, but Alison McFarlane, Lindsay Marsh, and Tamara Baldwin for helping facilitate tonight. I want to introduce Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, who I don't know when the first time we actually first met, but over the past number of years, I've come to not only respect, but enjoy our deep discussions and banter that we've had about so many topics. It's so wonderful to connect with an Indigenous woman who, I don't think anybody would argue, has really embraced her power and the power of our ancestors and the work that she does. So Mary Ellen, welcome. Welcome to Matriarch Illuminations. And maybe I'll get you started with a question. Does that sound good?
That sounds wonderful.
Why do you think it's important that Indigenous women take up that space and take up the mantle to make law?
Well, first of all, I also want to say thank you for the lovely introduction and just say how happy I am to join you, Jessica, tonight and say hello to everybody and make sure everybody is safe and well. And I'm actually zooming in from Lekwungen speaking people's territory tonight, so I'd like to recognize that as well. But in terms of First Nations, women, and matriarchs taking up the space of making law, I can only speak about it from more of a Cree or Nehio viewpoint, which is, we have this saying, which is grandmother makes the law, grandfather enforces it. So it's a pretty natural state of affairs. And I would say for sure my career in the law, play as a lawyer or judge or professor, or now as an advocate in different things, collaborator, making the law is like a pretty natural state of affairs. It's just having been excluded from those spaces for so long as women, and especially as we begin to like take apart these kind of like colonial laws and policies, it's so important to have Indigenous women in the space. And so I can say that, like, for me, although I've done a lot of things in my career, one of the most joyful and pleasant things that I was involved in was actually when in the province of British Columbia, a number of us as officials or lawyers, for myself on behalf of Union of BC Indian Chiefs, we got to work together with you, Jessica, to think about how would we implement the UN declaration in BC, like the technical work, right? And it was really wonderful. I'm just so happy to have this dialogue with you, because it was just really wonderful to be in that space with another Indigenous woman and have Indigenous people at the table. And so often, I've often been in that place where I've been completely alone. And it's like having to always footnote everything and, you know, say, but we have these thoughts and views. And it was such a wonderful process to work with another Indigenous woman and other women that were there, because it's very natural to be making law and to be talking about it. And we're in this moment where we can actually talk about the experience of Indigenous women and creating meaningful space. It's not easy, but I'm really happy to have had like a good experience like that one together, because it's not like one person. Obviously government makes law, legislatures pass the law, but the work to prepare it and to do all of the kind of peacemaking that's necessary, it's wonderful to have women in that space, and to have women who are powerful but respectful and fun. So working with you is wonderful. And I know I would, if you don't mind, I just would say, like, I remember when you joined the government of British Columbia a few years ago, and you had done different kind of work. And I remember hearing about you, they're like, we have this Jessica Wood coming. And I was like, wow, she sounds great. And then I heard sort of all of the, yeah, but she doesn't know this and she doesn't know that, and all of this kind of like deficit, like you hadn't been like a senior, like official in the BC government before. So we heard all the chatter. And I was like, well, she sounds pretty awesome. I can't wait to meet her. And the amazing thing is, like, you just sort of came into that space and you engaged so seamlessly with First Nations and Métis people, but also it was just such a natural thing. Like, you know, whereas we have to do like relationship building frequently, it was like so wonderful to have you in that space as a senior policy advisor, making law, you know, navigating that space, but also shifting the dialogue to a very different place. So I think women, like, it is our place to make law. It is our place to have those discussions. But when we take that place, it's really actually a lot of fun.
It is a lot of fun to work with you, I have to admit. I mean, and it should be, you know, that's part of our tradition. It's hard work. And I think we've spoken of this before. It's that conundrum, right? It's ambitious and practical. But if it's not fun, if it's not safe to start. And it's not fun as well. If we don't actually have the potential to enjoy it, then it makes it really difficult. I'll say the benefit of being in that position is having folks who have, like yourself, who, I mean, and maybe we can touch on this. You're the first, you know, being a judge and starting the first circle court, having that experience of having been a judge and being able to collaborate with Indigenous women who have not only been policy advisors, but have actually ruled in law and have that expertise and that mastery to the point where it's like art. Where so often law becomes this, strict interpretation, and we try to write it in a way that is a strict interpretation. And then there's this room that we were able to build together that just creates so much potential. And I imagine that was not your first time doing that. And I think back to, establishing the first circle court and being an Indigenous judge and an Indigenous woman in that judgeship, and what that was like for you.
Yeah, that was quite a process, because back in the day when I was one of the first judge in Saskatchewan, First Nations judge, the elders in particular, like I said to them, they really want me to be a judge, but like I'm so comfortable in this place I'm in with community and doing things, and they're like, we think you should do that. And I was like, but I don't want to be away from everybody. Like, it's so lonely to be over there, right? And they're like, well, you need to build bridges and go over there. And there's so many barriers, and really what we would call today systemic racism and mistreatment. And when I went to the court, it was really weird, because when I was a judge, I'd be like, of course, up there in my robes, making decisions. And Val Napoleon from UVic, who's a matriarch that I love and talk to, she always teases me, because one time she came into my court when I was a judge, and she was there supporting someone in her family, and I was deciding a case. And she teases me because I was like, had everybody in the law, like there's a barrier, only certain people can stand in front of it. You have to be a member of the bar, and there's all these rules. And I was up there, but it was a case involving a First Nations kid that was in a lot of trouble, and his grandmother was in the court, his Kokum, or grandmother. And so I'm like, who's here with you today? And the grandmother's like, I am. And I'm like, well, I would like to hear from you. And Val teases me, because she's like, I let the person come, the grandmother, come right up to where the lawyers stand. And she just like talked like, this is what's happening with my grandchild, and I need you to help me. And like, this can't happen. And it was like a conversation between like two First Nations women that would just meet. And Val, who runs the Indigenous Law Program and is supporting that, laughed so hard at the time, but she still laughs about it. And then I said, okay, well, I'm really gonna I've got to really reflect on this, And then grandmother went back, whatever. And then I made my decision. And then the lawyers were sort of standing like, what the hell? Like, what was this? And it was kind of like a different communication, because, and it wasn't that I was trying to give the grandmother a space that other people didn't have. It's just that people have never heard. So when there was a First Nations judge, and it was a First Nations grandmother, and she's like, I'm going to tell that Mary Ellen what's going on with my grandson. And I'm like, well, I would really like to hear. And, I'm sure she gave me a lot of incriminating evidence against the grandson. She's like, he's acting up. But it was just that whole piece of when you're in a space. And then that was what really drove me to have like a circle court, right? Where we wouldn't have someone up on a dais, like elevated in a robe, but come down more, where we can meet each other directly and listen, right? Because part of the barrier, the intimidation in all of these systems is, do Indigenous people and Indigenous women have a place in that circle? And for a long time, like as one of the first people that walked in, there wasn't a lot of space, and it's a lot of aggression that you face. And so myself as an Indigenous woman working in this area, like I remember what that felt like. So when I see other Indigenous women in the space, I'm like, wow, like I'm so excited. I can't wait to get to know Jessica. And like, it's like, I feel like I've known you forever, of course, but also that's a testament to your incredible skills and talent and education. And you had kind of an unconventional like path, but you're like a legal like warrior, and you know so much. But it was just this sort of piece of like, it's not really about the degrees. It's not really about the years of experience and the notches in your belt, but it's about a kind of communication and connecting that is really about, we know we have these really deep problems with colonialism that have like so hurt people. And particularly as women, thinking about the practicalities of our families and our communities is like, how do we stand up for people, but how do we begin to unwind this? And how do we actually, we can't do it alone, right? We have to work together. And there's so much strength in that, but women have never been in the circle, right? But then as a few women come into the circle, it gets a lot easier. So matriarchs have no trouble walking right up and saying, this is what I think. And, you know, other people would say, sit down, you're in contempt or whatever. I'd be like, you know, come on up. Like, let's talk about it. And when you talk to people and you meet them and find out what is it that they need to have solved. And so for when we look about some of the work we did in British Columbia together on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, like what is it that we were working on, right? We're trying to unwind 140 years of colonialism. That's a big project and we can't make too many mistakes. And we have a lot of people to talk to and listen to. And it's not about one person, but the gift of that sort of role is one of developing respect because you listen to people. You actually care about people, you listen, but you like the people that you get to work with along the way. Like, I mean, it just, that gives me joy. It doesn't matter about whatever. It just gives me joy to see that Indigenous women are in the space. It's a natural role anyway, but what they're bringing to that space is like, you know, a kind of life and hope and resilience that we've never really had in that space. So it's pretty exciting.
I think there's so many things about this experience that we've shared together, but also the wisdom that's coming from it. It's not that we don't belong in these spaces, it's that we don't belong here alone. And the Mushum and Cookum based law, we have that with the Tsimshian and the Gitxsan too. In my family, we refer to it as justice. I would rather go to jail or face a judge than my grandmother's left eyebrow. there's just, she is the law, and she has raised more kids than we will ever have, and, you know, fed them all on $1 for 4 years, and she gets up before me and goes to bed after me, and I can't keep up. And that's power. That's power, but there's also power in that community. And I love how much you uphold Indigenous women, because so often our systems, the institutions that we navigate through actually build division and suspicion and contribute to that lateral dismantling of our communities. And when we come together, the power is so amazing. It's beautiful, it's overwhelming, it's blinding, it's very effective. So I love that, and I love how much you champion that. So you talked about, you know, having those hard conversations at times that other folks on ceremony, et cetera, would step away from, and you've had a lot, you've made a full career of having hard conversations and not making them hard on people, but still being incredibly honest and fearlessly honest and direct. And I think I would do a disservice to not bring up the recent healthcare report that you authored, that you were asked to do by Minister Dix. You just released a report, and you called on for some changes in how the law works specifically in relation to health. And you've talked so much about the experiences of Indigenous women. What is the foundation of that inspired those recommendations for you in your investigation?
Yeah, that was quite a process leading to this recent report called In Plain Sight, which was looking at racism in BC's healthcare system. I did a lot of engagement with First Nations and Métis and Inuit people in BC and healthcare professionals. So like more than 9,000 like surveys and cases. And we had a little team, myself and another Indigenous woman, Harmony Johnson, and lots of Indigenous people on the team, and, you know, great team, fantastic. But what I really connected with was, as soon as we had a 1-800 number and an email, you know, it just like went out, like blew up, right? And people are like, I need to talk to you. And then, I mean, I couldn't talk to everybody. I had a team. Sometimes I had to talk to them, but the cases started to come forward, of cases of where a lot of women experience racism and sexism, and a lot of women that are caregiving, like they're trying to take care of their grandchildren, their own kids, they're working, like they can't get care, or they've had so many like difficult and racist experiences in terms of the prejudices. So as I was engaging with like a lot of First Nations and Métis people, mostly First Nations, but Métis also, it was just like so important to validate, right? And for them, they're like, this is the first time anybody's ever talked to me and actually believed what I have to say, right? And actually is going to look into it. And then some of the cases, like some of the women I talk to, like, I mean, I love talking to some of the women, and they'd be like, I just want you to go to the hospital and take out of my file the fact that there's a purple dot in there that says I'm a troublemaker every time I go to the hospital, when I'm like, was a survival sex worker, I need support, like you need to just like do this for me. Can you do this for me? I'd be like, well, for sure, that's easy. Like I plan on changing the whole system if I need to, so I can get the dot taken out of your file. But so the whole piece of talking to people, validating, but then hearing what they need, right? And like what a lot of Indigenous people said to me was, I want you to take this racism that we've experienced, this direct abusive interactions where discrimination is driving it, like we're thinking we're drunk and we're incompetent, all of these terrible, I need to give a trigger warning, terrible racist views. And we want you to give it back to the system. But like give it back to the people that need to do something about it, because we want cultural safety for sure, but also we just want validation. And some of like, you know, we did these complex surveys. Like one of the people that did a survey was an 86-year-old First Nations man who'd been to residential school, had like an entire life of racism, discrimination, never got a good education that he should have, suffered all kinds of abuse in all of these systems. Like he was in an Indian hospital, he was in residential school, but he did the survey, you know, and I was like practically in tears, you know, thinking this guy, this is a hard survey like to do. It's like, first it takes a long time. He doesn't even like technology. His son helped him. And he did the survey, and then he's like, you know, sends me the message. He's like, I don't have that internet or cable, but whatever you're doing today, go do it. And I really couldn't believe like how much people need to feel like, if you're a person that has power, power doesn't come from a title, right? It comes from trust and faith. People had trust and faith. I have to take it forward and I have to make something happen that's going to be different. And it's also part of that matriarch, like I'm a fixer, like I can't help it. Like if someone tells me about a problem, I have to do something about it. Like I'm not good at just listening. And I would say it reminds me of something else I did in my career a lot, which is in child welfare. And I talk about this with my, my friend and former colleague, Melanie Mark, who's now a minister in the BC government. We worked on child welfare cases. And I remember one time we had this case where the social worker, non-Indigenous, we had a complex case of an Indigenous family. And the social worker told us, I am God. He said, like, I am God. I will decide what happens about this family. Like, this is how the system works, right? And I remember Melanie and I were like, okay, so you're going to tell him or I'm going to tell him? You're not God anymore. Okay, you used to be God. Now there's a few Indigenous women here and we're going to start to actually like check this authority. And politely and using the rules, but it was really like, did he actually just say that? And that's like, you know, to basically us. So I think this issue, like we're kind of feisty, but at the same time, unchecked power and abuse is something that we can't have in our homes. We can't have in our communities. And we really need to respect the courage of people who speak up, like the residential school survivors, like the people who talk about racism. How much courage does it take for them to do that? How hard is it for us to listen? It's not hard, but then how hard is it for us to actually make changes? It's not hard to make changes because the true courage comes from being able to speak up, right? And to be able to be heard, that's the big thing. You gotta be able to hear. And then sometimes we have to amplify that voice. But I think it's that issue of seeking, like peacemaking and justice is pretty natural, but the experiences that people have had are so horrible and horribly wrong that the validation and the truth telling only works if someone actually believes, right? And so believing and listening. It's like, I know it's a tough thing to do for some people, but I view it as being a very honorable and very empowering thing, to be able to talk to people and people to be feeling comfortable enough to share. Because like, that is about the law. Because ultimately it's like, I haven't been treated right and I want this to change. Don't want my children or grandchildren to have this experience. And so that's our job, to have tools to do that, right? And to make sure our students and our colleagues are empowered to do the work they need to do.
I definitely feel and see that empowerment in you. You share it around with wild abandon, I would say, particularly when it comes to law. You share space and you create room for people to articulate it and to pursue it in its most, to its higher standard, in its most human and humanity affirming ways. I've seen the efforts of your labor come through so many policies and legislation. What do you think it means specifically at this time when we have the largest civil rights movement in global history? We've already had the TRC, we've had the hearings. There's been so much around the truth telling, where the UN Declaration is now potentially, another piece of legislation under consideration federally, but it's at least been adopted. There's no restriction. We have all of these tools. What do you think is the next step, given we have the tools, we have recommendations, let's assume we have a willing society, and yet the system tends to repeat itself, regardless of our input or output tends to remain very similar. So what's next from your perspective? We're here, we have the option. I'm often, people talk about changing the system from the inside. I've worked in many different institutions, and I worked on the residential school settlement agreement under the Harper government. But everybody has a realm of influence from my perspective, and a realm of responsibility. And with Indigenous people, we have this heightened accountability. And I think there's hope, but I'm curious where that thread for you goes. Where's the joy? Where's the next piece of joy? You spend a lot of time looking at hard things.
I do, but I think what's really significant, it's so interesting that the first year that we have the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in law in British Columbia, and yes, we've had a global pandemic that has in many ways caused us not to be in spaces. But I really liked what you said, Jessica, about how we don't belong here alone, right? And it's really been a challenge with COVID to remind, and how much more I'd prefer to be in person tonight, and then the unnatural state of having to separate elders from families and everything people are going through. It's really challenging. So even to proceed, even if we have say federal legislation to implement under it, if it can just get through with the pandemic, I'd be happy, because I think the pandemic for Canada and Black Lives Matter and the movement for land back and Indigenous sovereignty, these are very important things that don't stop because of a pandemic. But the pandemic has really exposed some of the mean injustices in our society as well, and that people have nothing to lose to address it. And I think that that's powerful. So I feel really, I really feel like there's a space, an opportunity to do things that we didn't have, even though we have this horrible condition of this pandemic. But it's also shown something we've been talking about for a long time. And it's about racism. And that's the other thing I was going to say is people were obsessed about the UN Declaration coming into law in BC. And most of the opposition, we all came together and it was unanimous, and there was a lot of support, a lot of dialogue. But if and there's people at the School for Public Policy and Global Affairs that have written about this, like Dr. Cheryl Lightfoot wrote a book on global diplomacy and so forth. But when I watched the debate unfold and was in it, and then where I am today, everything was about free, prior, informed consent. That's all we heard about. And I kept sort of thinking well, actually, we're kind of interested in the anti-racist part, right? And everybody's like, no, they're going to like, you know, consent and they'll stop this and that. It's like all this mythology. And it was like really stereotypical mythology too, that like you can't work with Indigenous governments, that people. So what I love about where we are in 1 year, even though it's like hard, is that mandate letters in government, officials, everyone has had to come to terms with the declaration. And what does it say? Like it says, Indigenous people have a right to be free from all forms of discrimination. So for the first time, we've actually had these conversations about what does discrimination look like? What are the anti-racist tools that we may need to address it, whether that be in the university, in the society, in the healthcare system, wherever. So it's again, one of those things where I think matriarchs, if you would have asked them, you know, they'll be like, well, yeah, FPIC is really important, but you guys are like crazy obsessed about it. We would have probably said what's really important is like eliminating discrimination against Indigenous people in these very basic areas like health, education, the justice system, you know, and all of these things that, like, again, the pandemic and Black Lives Matter has assisted us to expose it. And anti-Indigenous racism is different than other forms, but the declaration, the power is like, it's really not a bad thing, right? Like, it's like all of these fears, like how much time was spent with this opposition to the idea that Indigenous governments may have a consent or have a role in the development of their own territory, right? Like that was just like fixated. And it is something that will have to be addressed because there have been massive developments done without respecting Indigenous people in their territory. That's the history of Canada and BC. But we actually have used these tools in the declaration to actually begin something else too. Like it's more than one thing. So it's kind of like what everybody thought was going to happen and then what happened. And that is like that we have like pivot, to use the language of the system. Like, have we pivoted? No, like I think we were always going to do this work together. And so I like the fact that the declaration and the tools, and when we think about where are we going to go next, well, addressing the systemic racism, prejudice, the absence of Indigenous people from these places is going to be, there's not going to be any turning back, right? That's a big thing in British Columbia, and it's turning out to be better. Like everyone says, this is a better place than it was because we're going to get there. But you're right about what you said earlier. There's sometimes has to be hard conversations, but let's at least have the conversation that's relevant and like not just make up like some red herring, right? Like this is, what is the issue that's relevant? It's not free, prior, informed consent to something. It's really about how do people treat each other? And how has this been tolerated for so long? And now that it's no longer legal to do this, you know, like it's like the steam comes out, right? The steam in the pressure cooker is starting to come out. And it's almost like for Indigenous people, it's like it's safe, it's safer. It could be safer, not completely, but it's a safer place to be. So that's really positive.
It's so, I mean, you said FPIC, so we might pause there just for a minute. And just, since we're talking about matriarchy, honestly, somebody asked me recently, well, what do you say to those folks who say it's not achievable or they don't know what it means? And we've based common law on non-coercion in so many different ways. We teach it in everything from business to sexual health. If you want to understand what consent, speak to women. It's the concept is no different. And it's okay. We teach it and we accept it. Why is it unacceptable when it comes to Indigenous people or Indigenous women? So from my perspective, there's an overcomplication, like you say, of what the holistic implications are of UNDRIP, of the UN Declaration. It's our humanity, plain and simple. Not more complicated, not more important, just our own humanity. And that shouldn't be a threat to anybody. So I
really like that comment, because that idea that somehow FPIC is a threat, right? Like everything was great before, like the beliefs, the doctrine of discovery, like that's kind of a fiction. The behaviors, oh, let's take in the bulldozers and like kind of like just go to someone's land and do things and ask questions later. And then of course the systems that would never really give fairness. And so in my profession, you know, we had to go to the Supreme Court of Canada multiple times in cases over the years and to seek justice, which was long and slow. So it wasn't exactly working well before. So the idea of actually working together in a respectful way, it's really not, it's not such a radical shift, but also you're absolutely right. It's really that other resistance. Like, what is the problem with that? But it became like just an obsessive thing. And I'm sure as we get federal legislation, we'll see another wave of it. And it's kind of like, we're having like, you're from Mars, I'm from Venus. We're not actually even are we even having the same conversation? And I know like when we were dealing with DRIPA, sometimes we'd have the conversations about like, what are they saying? Like we couldn't figure it out. Like, what exactly is it that they're saying? They're saying that they don't want to work with Indigenous people in advance in their territory. Like, we don't get it. Like, okay, what are they saying? They do, but they don't want Indigenous people to have any power in that situation. And they don't want to, we don't know whose traditional territory and all these things. So it was like really interesting to try and figure out like, what do you talk about when you talk about this? Like, what are we really talking about? And so I think that we've worked through a lot of these issues, but I also would say how much I respect the fact that, like, you know, every legislator in the government of BC Legislative Assembly stood up for the same principles, right? Then that was incredibly validating. While voices of women and matriarchs are important, like, was that the only time we've ever had people fully stand up? It was a wonderful feeling in the Legislative Assembly. I know you were there and I was there, and like a lot of leaders were there and others, and just, it was a great feeling, that sense of unity and that sense of kind of, I'm not saying prevailing, but respect. It was just like so good. Like it was, okay, it wasn't as good as when I had my children, okay, but it was getting close. It was like birthing and I kept thinking, like, is this what the post-reconciliation world will feel like if we can actually make this work? Well, and I'm very cynical and like skeptical. I don't want to be like, I'm not saying everything's.
I don't think so.
But the feeling, the emotion of like saying goodbye to conversations that had never got us anywhere, to conversations that matter. It was like such a good feeling. And I do feel like we, despite being in a pandemic, we have really strengthened our bonds with a lot of people. A lot more respectful dialogue. And like you said, you know, we don't belong here alone. And when British Columbia actually endorsed the declaration and implemented into the laws of BC and began this project seriously, then you feel like, well, yeah, we're not entirely here on our own. This was, you know, a big shift. And I mean, having a baby was better. Okay, I'm going to say it out of that. My daughter just texted me from the other room saying, what? Having me wasn't that great? One of my 4 kids, but having a child was better. Okay, sorry, sweetheart. But the feeling was more of the connection after a long period of not really having any good news from those houses, like legislatures, to feeling like, wow, this is a great sense of change. And so having walked that path, like with you, Jessica, too, I mean, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I mean, you know, that was quite a complicated experience, right? Because it was there and we were all there together. People came from everywhere, right? And all different leaders, like elected chiefs, hereditary chiefs, matriarchs, children, people who have been pushing and really advocating for justice for a long time. So, I mean, I don't know what your reflections are now, like a year later, but I mean, I still get a really warm, positive feeling when I think about that.
The day of introduction, for those that were there, I think we all have a moment, and it was an overwhelming feeling to see those who even at one time would have fought against each other, who may have even fought against their own entitlement to their own to the validation of their rights here, and to share that with my community and with leaders, and to see our youth on the floor, to see our people on the floor of the People's House that hasn't been afforded to include us in the meaningful ways that we should be. I think it'll change everything that follows. I think that day for me was one of the most affirming pieces of what hope can do and how it can be articulated in the most unlikely of places. I have to say, I have spent more time around spaces like that, feeling like I am railing against it than a part of it. And to see our people take their space and their rightful place on the floor, speaking to the House, speaking to the entire province, to affirm what we already know in our own Unduck, in our own law, in provincial law. It is very much a birth from my perspective. It is going to go on to have a life that we hope for it, that we could probably never even imagine. And hopefully long after I or we or we've all passed, is it should have a life of and a legacy of its own. And that we brought it to that moment, but some of the work that it has to do, that law has to do, it's that is something I can't even contemplate, but that is hope embodied that day. That was, I mean, to be there with Romeo, to be there with Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, to be there with the matriarchs, my cousin, my children, to see Jody there, to see like those who have carried that baton so many times, and everybody hoped and nobody expected us to succeed, any one of us, but that didn't stop us from trying. And so it took all of those people in the room and so much more to be able to bring that moment into creation, and to see just a tiny reflection of some of those people to come together at that moment. What it sets for me is a hope and a duty to see it through, to get it started in its life in a good way, just like we would anything that we built together as a community. Is now we have to nurture it. We brought it into being, and now we have to give it life. So
yeah, and it's funny because often in the December meetings at the UN General Assembly, they'll re-ratify the declaration, like for the International Day of Indigenous People. And I don't know with COVID and virtual sittings if they will, but also that beautiful feeling. And then for me, like you said before, like welcoming people into that space. Like we were there, we got to have this like incredible privilege to be part of this process, right? And to have like so many respectful and funny dialogues, right? Like I will just say this for people listening, the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, we'd have meetings, they only give you half a muffin, they don't give you a full muffin, okay? They try to starve you out. And we'd have a lot.
Until I got there.
Yeah, then you would be like, Mary Ellen, you can have a whole muffin. I'm like, thank you, Jessica. But the process of creating space and like making sure that people are welcome into it. So now that it has passed, okay, and we do take things away, but one of the things we have to take away is to think, that was a tenure, like the battle to negotiate that in the hearts and minds of people who had to do compromise in the Indigenous diplomacy that happened globally. And then we did this in British Columbia and the diplomacy that had to happen there, right? But new people, like students maybe listening tonight, are going to enter that space, right? And so for me as one person, I want them to be supported in that space. I want Indigenous people in particular to be supported to come into that space where before there'd be like one or two of us. Like that's a really big change, right? And to offer their reflections. And there will be people who say, oh, it didn't do enough, or like Grand Chief Stuart Phillip says, reconciliation is not for wimps, like it's hard. It is hard. We have a lot of conflicts. We have much work to do. And there's going to be probably criticism about whether it's hitting the mark or not from, I hope, especially younger people who are in school and questioning things. Like they have to question. It's good to question, right? But one thing that's really important is connect with people who are going to welcome you into a space, right? And the matriarchs welcome you into a space. And it's a space, we may have been involved in some little bit of birthing moment with it, but there's lots of room, right? There's lots of room. And UBC, you know, when they adopted their Indigenous strategic plan and adopted the declaration into their planning at the university, well, yeah, it's the law in BC, so it had to be adopted if you like, but they did it with real seriousness too, because it meant a lot. And creating that safe space of welcoming people in university and government as we come out and talk about the implementation of the declaration and some of those key rights, like, you know, how powerful they are, like ending things like what we do talk about as genocide, you know, and when we talk about the Missing and Murdered Women's Inquiry, like the removal of generations of children, the loss of language, the breakdown of family, like there's a lot of work to be done, but we have these tools to talk about things in a way that's like, instead of like you and I both wear glasses, I don't see very well without my glasses. When I put my glasses on, it's a bit like seeing things through under. We have a lot of learning to do about the declaration together, right? Like we've got it. We now have to kind of like really understand what it means, right? And make sure it's actioned. And also have that conversation and make sure we don't just go back to, now let's get rid of the matriarchs and we're going to like figure it out over here. So I think it's going to be a bit of a wave, but I do think the mentality, you can persevere through difficult times if you've experienced that kind of solidarity like we experienced when this legislation was introduced. You can make it through a pandemic. You can make it through isolation. You can make it through tough times. If in your life and career, you've had people welcome you in, treat you well, and connect you, right? You can make it through a lot. We're very resilient, but when the door's always slammed in your face, it can be a little harder. So, I mean, I'm so grateful to you, Jessica, because you came into a space like the government of British Columbia, and you used the power that you were given to make it an even bigger circle and to make other women in particular feel safe. And I really, really appreciate your leadership doing that and everything you've done. So thank you so much for that.
I'm sorry to jump in. It's just about the time that we go into the Q&A. So I'll start with the first question that has the most upvotes from Aaron. With the number of Indigenous children in care and dealing with the CFCSA, how can the concept of healing plans, circle court, Indigenous courts, be more broadly incorporated into the family relations plan and result in better outcomes for children and their families?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it's also about, you know, we are in a process of really unwinding these provincial child welfare systems that were imposed on Indigenous families and kind of have this life of their own. They're almost like a perverse performance measure, like it's take the children away. And we're in this process of changing that dialogue. So how do we support families? How do we keep families together? And we're also in the point of trying to get people reconnected. Like we've had people in the system that have lost their connection. So how do we do reconnection? So things like a circle are really important, because it's about, like, you don't have one person who's the all powerful, like we have to bring it back. And also family connections are so important, and people decide, like, we all have families, we all have conflicts. You can get like way too rigid, like, and think, well, my family, like I saw this a lot in the child welfare system with youth and children in care, like, you know, I'm so angry at my family, they rejected me. You know, I'd be like, well, that's not really how it happened. And like, maybe there will come a day when you can have that conversation, because I don't think that's really how it worked. And they're like, well, that's what I was told, you know? And I'm like, well, why don't we just like have a reach out and see what we think? And when I have seen family reunification and coming back to community, it's pretty transformative in the lives of people who have been lost into the system. So we have to actively build bridges. Like we need to reconnect. Like there's a lot of roots, a lot of reconnecting work, and a lot of Indigenous people have been doing that for a long time. And lawyers and others have not always helped them, right? But now I feel like we have more that will stand up, more help. We have a Indigenous legal clinic at Allard that will work on that. We have a RISE clinic. Like there's more people willing to do this work and more success. So some of the things we're talking about here about, you know, don't belong here alone, who's missing from this conversation, that's going to really influence how we address things like children's reunification with their families and communities.
Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Francis Mahon. What strategies can lawyers use to avoid re-traumatizing their clients while also ensuring that the client can tell their story to courts and other decision makers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not trying to take up all the space, Jessica. You might want to answer some of these too, but I think myself as someone who's had to run, like I've had to run trials, sexual assault trials, where there's been victims or child victims, you know, and I've had to be a victim support for people who have had to testify. You know, I've had to go sit in the court and help people and see how hard it is. For instance, that's the court process. Then even when it comes to this healthcare review of racism, you know, it's the trauma. Telling the story is really traumatic if the people that hear it dispute it constantly and pick apart, right? So like I saw this recently in the healthcare system, somebody wanted to have a meeting with the doctor in the hospital about something that really wrong that had happened to them. And the meeting was arranged, and then the doc spent about half an hour saying, but I'm not a racist, but I'm not a racist, but I'm not a racist. And no one ever had a conversation. So then, you know, the Indigenous woman was like re-traumatized because it's like, why did I even come to this meeting? You know, and I'm like, yeah, exactly. And so the whole piece was like, you do get re-traumatized in systems that are coercive and refuse to believe you. So if you like, we deny everything you say. And it's like, oh boy, here we go. So that's not a healing process. So part of it is being able to allow truth telling, being able to validate, and validate doesn't mean prove in law, validate an experience, and also validate why people are afraid, why they would be afraid to go somewhere because they've had so many bad experiences in the past, right? And I think that is good. And so lawyers, we do need to be very sensitive to trauma, including our own secondary trauma. You need to make sure, like in my life, I'm lucky I have a family, I have a dog, I have a tugboat that I take out in the Pacific Northwest to get away from it all. I like nature. You got to do a lot of things to keep yourself grounded in your values and beliefs, but you also need to make sure that you don't re-traumatize people. You know, like re-traumatizing is about denying and not making a safe space, right? So there has to be a lot of cultural humility work done, and our systems are not very good at it, but we are strengthening as more Indigenous people are in the space.
Thank you for that. I think we're coming towards the end. I think we have time for one more question. What do you think, Jessica?
I think we can do it. It looks like we have about 5 minutes, and then leave a couple minutes for closing us up in a good way.
Sure. So the last question comes from Juliana Proenza. She says, what can we do at the municipal level? We attempted to create an anti-racism equity plan for the District of Mission that went forward through Council Act, but the action part still seems to be missing. There was a group of community members that came together and worked on a statement that was presented to Council. Thank you.
Wow, that's great.
Oh yeah, I might take a first crack.
Go.
That's a fascinating. I don't think you've missed the mark at all. That's the point. These institutions, these governments are our governments. They serve us as people. We elect people. They are there in service. And I can point to the city of Vancouver and the work of Ginger Gosnell Myers to ensure that it was became the first city of reconciliation in Canada. I can tell you that other communities have also followed suit. If you look at the work of Jesse Hemphill to ensure that nations were actually voting members at the Union of BC Municipalities so that they could vote on resolutions in their own interests. There's so much work that's being done at the municipal level that I actually think if you're probably a leader in that space to ensure that these pieces come forward. The action part is always tough. The apologies, the laws, the action plans, the strategies, those are the foundations for the work to happen. And so building in that accountability into any strategy is always the key. It's building in that accountability, and that's something that that was under deep consideration, that was included in the Declaration Act in BC, is ensuring there is annual accountability, and to do so in collaboration, because in the spirit of actually being committed to moving forward means you need to do that reflection very regularly. So that's my offer to you of some places where some space has been made, and where some work has been done, and of course so much more to do. And of course there is a really strong recommendation in the recent health report to have an anti-racism act here in BC, which I think will be really powerful if that's able to come into play, and that may also give you some room. Do you have thoughts for our last question there, Mary Ellen?
I just like hands up for doing the work in mission, you know, and working with First Nations and bringing it into that council level. I really am happy for that work, and I do think that is important. And it's kind of like when I did the racism report and I talked about like atonement and apology, and the minister kind of did a big apology, but it's like apology should be at the point where people interact, and work together on reconciliation should be the point where people interact. And a lot of what happens is in a community basis. So I'm really happy to hear about that work in mission. And I know it's complicated and it's probably going to take a lot of conversations, but it's a good work. And I really want you to keep on it. And I hope, like Jessica said about Ginger's work in Vancouver, I think you're going to find some really good allies and supporters. And I think it can spread throughout the whole province because it needs to. But I'm really excited, and now I'm going to be watching for mission to see what happens. So thank you for that question.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me tonight, Akikwe, Mary Ellen, the Sergeant at Arms, for so many great things, and for keeping us all humble with your generous and loving teasing. Appreciate your time, appreciate your wisdom, and for sharing that with us tonight, and for joining us and being so generous with your experience and with your thoughts. I look forward to, I'm sure we probably will be connecting tomorrow after introduction of the federal bill. I'm sure I'll be making popcorn and sending you all kinds of thoughts and questions. And with that, just say Hamaya, thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. And thank you again to everyone, and Lillian for putting this together, and also for people taking time tonight to listen to us and to hear about our experiences. And trust me, this may not be the most perfect medium for us to meet in, but it was good in a way because we probably weren't laughing as much as normal. But I really do appreciate Jessica. And let me just say in conclusion, I appreciate the fact that she is also in charge of a complete stable full of ducks. So there you go.
Yes, the duck life, it's a duck life. For those who may want to rejoin us again tomorrow, our last and final installment of Matriarch Illuminations will be hosted tomorrow, same time, same process, register in advance, with Cheryl Lightfoot and Andrea Reimer, where we'll be talking about what's next, what comes next, and given all the things that we've heard, where's meaningful reconciliation to be found next. So thank you so much. I look forward to those who can join us tomorrow. Hamaya.